Tales of Mystery and Magic. Who lives in the skull? Who lives in the skull? Russian. Once upon a time, on top of a hill, there was a horse's skull. It had been lying there for a long time, and it was as clean as white as marble and as hollow as a seashell. One day, a mouse saw the skull and thought to himself, that would be a fine place to live. So he knocked on the white bone of the skull and said, "Hello, I'm Mr. Twitchery Snitchery, Nibble by Night. Does anyone live in the skull?" There was no answer, so the mouse crawled inside and set up the house, and very snug it was. Then one day a frog came knocking on the white bone. "Hello, I'm Mr. Hoppity Ploppity Paddle the Pond. Does anyone live inside the skull?" "Only me, Mr. Twitchery Snitchery Nibble by Night. Come inside, there's room enough for two." So the crawled inside, and they set up a house together, and very snug it was. And then, one day, a hare came knocking on the white bone. "Hello, I'm Mr. Loppily Goppily Lollopy Gollopy, King of the Corn. Does anyone live inside the skull?" "Only us, Mr. Twitchery Snitchery Nibble by Night and Mr. Hoppity Ploppity Paddle the Pond. Come inside, there's room enough for three." So the hare crawled inside, and they set up house together, and very snug it was, if it were a little cramped. Then one day a fox came knocking on the white bone. "Hello, I'm Mr. Navery Niffery, thief of the coop. Does anyone live inside the skull?" "Only us, Mr. Twitchery Snitchery, Nibble by Night, Mr. Hoppity Ploppity, Paddle by the Pond, and Mr. Lollopy Gallopy, King of the Corn. Come inside, there's room enough for four." So the fox crawled inside, and they set up house together, and very snug it was, if a little squashed. Then one day a wolf came knocking on the white bone. "Hello, I'm Mr. Slavering Slobbering Tongue on the Tilt. Does anyone live inside the skull?" "Only us, Mr. Twitchery Snitchery, Nibble by Night, Mr. Hoppity Ploppity, Paddle the Pond, Mr. Lollopy Gallopy, King of the Corn, and Mr. Canavery Knifery, Thief of the Coop. Come inside, there's room enough for five." So the wolf crawled inside, and they set up house together, and very snug it was, but very squashed. And then one day a bear came knocking on the white bone. "Hello, I'm Mr. Lumbersome Cumbersome. Sit on the lot. Does anyone live inside the skull?" And Mr. Twitchery Snitchery, Nibble by Night, Mr. Hoppity Ploppity, Paddle the Pond, Mr. Lollopy Gallopy, King of the Corn, Mr. Navery Knifery, Thief of the Coop, and Mr. Slavering Slobbering, Tongue on the Tilt, squashed together in the skull, and knowing there wasn't room enough for six, all shouted at once, "No! Nobody lives here! Nobody lives here at all!" And Mr. Lumbersome Cumbersome, sit on the lot, said, "Well, that's all right then." And he sat on top of the skull. He sat down on the top of the lot of them. Crunch! And whether any of them got out in time or whether they didn't, I don't know. But one thing I do know is this, that the bear is still pulling splinters of white bone out of his backside to this very day. When you tell this story, you can make one hand the skull and the other fingers and thumb on the other hand the animals that go inside. Choose one of your listeners to be the bear who sits on them all.